Pencil tapping, pen clicking, and nail biting, and leg bouncing are all repetitive motions that are a crutch to some who are feeling anxious or nervous. I personally have been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, and even simply being diagnosed has created multiple moments for the discussion about mental illness to arise with my friends and family. The medical definition of anxiety offered by the Webster Dictionary is, quote, an abnormal and overwhelming sense of apprehension and fear, often marked by physical signs, for containing doubt concerning the reality and nature of the threat, and by self-doubt about one's capacity to cope with it, end quote. Mental illness still has stigma surrounding it, but is also becoming more and more of a discussed topic within media and simply within families. How anxiety is interpreted and discussed throughout media and in other social situations further affect those that are diagnosed in both positive and negative ways. There are several forms of anxiety. First, specific phobias affect 8.7% of the American population. Social anxiety disorder, or SAD, affects 6.8% of Americans. Major depressive disorder affects 6.7% of the American population. Generalized anxiety, or GAD, affects 3.1% of America. Panic disorder has been diagnosed in 2.7% of Americans. And lastly, obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, affects 1% of Americans. According to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, or ADAA, there are several factors that can lead to the development of an anxiety disorder, including genetics, brain chemistry, personality, and life events. Not everyone is aware of the exact definitions of anxiety, which does lead to misinformation, misdiagnosis, self-diagnosis, and even ignorance. According to Webster Dictionary, stigma is a, quote, mark of shame or discredit, end quote. The dictionary even goes to discuss its origins, which are Greek and Latin, and it says that it is, quote, a mark or brand, especially one that marked a slave. So a stigma marked a person as inferior, end quote. The general idea of stigma is a roadblock that can eventually lead towards either mistreatment of those misdiagnosed as mentally ill, or the lack of people looking for the help they need because they're afraid to show how their life will change after being labeled as mentally ill. The journal article Mental Illness Stigma, Problem of Public Health or Social Justice by Patrick Corrigan and his colleagues has a selection of texts in which they discuss the idea of stigma that surrounds thinking of mental illness in a biological sense, which is how the, quote, public health approach believes mental illness should be discussed. This biological approach leads to the fact that, quote, people who endorse genetic casualty are less likely to blame individuals for their mental illness. However, this same group is also pessimistic that people with mental illness will recover, end quote. This is a specific group of people who believe that they are aiding those with mental illness, but eventually end up making the lives of those that are diagnosed filled with more struggles against stigma than before. According to another study of adolescents from 2001 to 2004, the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIMH, discovered that 31.9% of adolescents aged 13 to 18 are diagnosed with an anxiety disorder that will stick with them for the rest of their lives. Even though there has been attention turned towards adolescents in the onset of anxiety, quote, in many cases, child anxiety will be unrecognized and untreated, end quote. Because these symptoms of anxiety during childhood can relate to things like homesickness, separation anxiety, attention and concentration struggles, difficulty with social behaviors, and self-esteem, the diagnosis of anxiety can sometimes be left behind. When untreated, adolescent insomnia can also continue into adulthood and cause long-term problems that can lead to even more stress, prolonged anxiety, and further lifelong complications, including but not limited to self-medication and non-prescription drug use. Morrison and Story decide that being able to treat insomnia in adolescence is most beneficial because there is a greater chance of being able to combat insomniac behaviors within adolescents than within adults because it will become a learned behavior once they are adults. They use the term, quote, down in the dumps to be synonymous with anxious, end quote, which is a common phrase to use as a descriptor towards moody children. They state that identifying sleep disturbances in an adolescent is as easy as asking a few questions, creating a questionnaire, and tracking sleeping patterns. If you're able to determine if a child has insomnia, why is there such a hesitancy for diagnosis? Well, a medical study in 1978 states that adolescents being prescribed sleeping aids that are inevitably harmful or, quote, toxic, end quote. There's an intrinsic fear that is instilled in the minds of those wary of medication that is heightened when put into these situations. Sticking with the topic of adolescence and straying away from the medication side, the stigma that surrounds adolescents that are diagnosed with anxiety fall to the fear of being bullied by their peers. This idea plays into the total stigma that surrounds mental health and goes to show just how young these stigmas can be instilled into children. An article by Despacito and her colleagues entitled, quote, Adolescents' Vulnerability to Peer Victimization, Interpersonal and Intrapersonal Predictors, end quote, earlier stated that the peer victimization that is prevalent in society eventually leads to feelings of anxiousness or depression. This anxiousness or depression can lead into another cycle of being bullied again because they are showing those traits of being anxious or depressed. So these children will try to suppress these feelings instead of getting them diagnosed, as they don't want to give their bullies another reason to attack them. Okay. While it does feel rather impossible to completely eradicate the idea of childhood and adolescent anxiety, preventative measures can be extremely helpful in taking away stigma as well as preparing those diagnosed with further knowledge that will help them as they age. According to Jessica Minahan and Jerome J. Schultz, quote, stress and excessive anxiety impairs the brain's ability to process, acquire, and store new information, end quote. This inhabitation of new information to be processed leads to what we know to be called the fight, flight, or freeze reaction. Commonly, when a student hits the reaction and either lashes out or freezes up, there's a misdiagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. So lastly, the discussion of anxiety disorders and mental illness within media and outward society has become more prevalent as the years pass. It's also coming to terms that the diagnosis of anxiety is a worldwide phenomenon. So firstly, Adam Busby, who is from the TLC show Outdaughtered, is the father of 6 girls, 5 of which are quintuplets. And he became honest with reviewers about his postpartum depression. Commonly, we always think of postpartum depression in the eyes of a mother, but in an article from late 2017 on People magazine, Busby states, quote, I want men to feel comfortable opening up about their feelings and expressing the struggles they are going through. I want to help end the stigma surrounding mental health, end quote. I think it's interesting that he stresses the fact that he wants other men to feel comfortable in discussing situations like the one he is in. Secondly, Chris Evans is most famously known for his role as Captain America in the Marvel franchise, a character that spent the early part of his life trying to fight Nazis and the later part of fighting off aliens and even more Nazis. While his role is extremely masculine and extremely confident, the actor himself has admitted to falling victim to his anxiety at points. He almost didn't take the role of Captain America, saying that in an article with Men's Health magazine, he only barely managed to control his anxiety, and times it almost got the best of him. When asked why he almost said no to the role of Captain America, Evans said, quote, if the strings attached are 6 movies, that's a scary loss of control that I just wasn't ready to process, end quote. The fact that he also went to his therapist to discuss his actions also helps kind of destigmatize the idea that men don't need to face their anxious tendencies, and it kind of brings down the whole role of a masculine man and not having to face their feelings. Lastly, the Child Mind Institute is a, quote, independent national nonprofit dedicated to transforming the lives of children and families struggling with mental health and learning disorders, end quote. And they kickstarted a project a few years ago called the #MyYoungerSelf Initiative, in which athletes, actors, and other celebrities talk about their struggles with mental illness or learning disorders to try and find the stigmas that surround it. Kristen Bell, known for her acting and voicing of Anna in Frozen, talked to herself in a video about how you must take care of yourself first, even in the wild ride that is Hollywood. At one point, she states, quote, never feel embarrassed or ashamed about the uniqueness that is you, end quote. Bell was diagnosed with anxiety and depression at age 18, and the words she chooses to tell herself are uplifting yet very simple. Sometimes, to be able to get past the bigger hurdles that come with anxiety, you must start on the smaller side. So, in conclusion, the stigmas that follow mental health happen in a broad sense and a very personal basis as well. I remember when I was first diagnosed, and I wished for it to never be talked about because I wasn't comfortable with it, and I didn't want my family talking about it. Even though I still have to explain to myself and teach some family members about how I may think different or react to situations in a different manner, it doesn't mean I am other, but it is still a learning process and a learning curve. Stigmas are not something that can be immediately forgotten. They're so ingrained into our society that breaking such practice could potentially take years, decades. I believe that process can be made through open discussions and attentive listening and learning by those who aren't diagnosed, whether they know someone who's been diagnosed or not. Thank you.